All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Carpenter. I'm the State Director of New York Agriculture in the Classroom, and we are so excited to bring you one of our spring virtual professional development experiences, talking about compost and soil. Hopefully everyone received their shipments and their goodies from us. We're going to be using those. So even though this is a virtual experience, we do love some interaction as much as possible to make it really reminiscent of what you would be doing if we were all spending time together in person. So we hope you've had a wonderful day with your students. I just want to talk through a little bit of what our plan is for today. We hope that you've had a chance to go through and introduce yourself on the Padlet. Take a look who else is with you here today. So many of you have done it already. We love that you've been able to introduce yourselves. The first thing that we're going to do today, we're going to take a little tour of the Oneida Herkimer Authority. We're going to look at their compost system. This is kind of your virtual field trip experience of the day. We're also going to experience 2 lessons, and we're going to have a new friend to New York Agriculture in the Classroom, Bill Richmond, join us from the Adirondack Worm Farm. And then your day is going to end by learning how you get shipped your own ½ pound of worms. So that's our plan for today. We're excited to dig into compost with you. And I am really excited to introduce our New York Agriculture in the Classroom educator, Jeremiah Best. And he's going to help lead you through many of our sessions today. But also don't forget, pop any questions you want into the chat box. So this is going to be an interactive learning session. So we want to hear from you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody, as Katie mentioned, had a wonderful day. It is absolutely amazing the last couple of days. I'm sure many of you have been outside taking walks and enjoying the weather, and it's pretty amazing. I'm here in Inlet, New York, which is in the heart of the Adirondacks. And it just has been a great experience. We're sitting on about a foot of snow still, but we're starting to get the soils to wake up. I don't know how many of y'all were able to take a walk this weekend and really start to notice things making that big change and big transition into what my 3-year-old likes to call grass time, what we call here in the Adirondacks mud time. So we'll talk about that here. But first, we're going to introduce you to Miss Samantha Brown. Miss Samantha Brown is the recycling coordinator at the Authority, which is the waste management organization in Utica, Herkimer, and Oneida, New York. Samantha, how are you? I see that you're still on mute.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, awesome. We have you now. So,
did we just mute me?
We have you. So it's great to see you again.
Awesome. Hi, Jeremiah. How are you?
Doing well. We met Samantha this winter. We did a field trip to a Christmas tree farm, and then we followed that up to see what happens when our agricultural byproducts, as we harvest that Christmas tree, becomes waste and how we can reuse that. So Samantha, how are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Samantha Brown. I am the recycling coordinator for the Oneida Herkimer Solid Waste Authority. So most of my job is setting up recycling programs in businesses and schools, but I also help to manage the compost site here down at our Utica location on Leland Ave. And that's what we're going to be looking at today.
So we are looking at a ton of soil behind you. How do you start this process? Where does all this come from? We can see that the transfer station behind you, we have a large area. How big is this area, and how does all this come about?
Sure. So at this site, we have 5 different facilities. So like you mentioned, in the back, we have our recycling center where all the recyclables for Oneida and Herkimer County come. We sort them, ship them out to recycling mills. And we have our transfer station, which is the first stop your garbage makes before it heads up to the landfill. So we kind of consolidate it into big trailers, and they drive up to our landfill in the town of Ava, just outside of Boonville. Here, take source separated food waste, and we're actually to depackage that material, mix it with gray water, and send it to the Oneida County wastewater treatment plant, where they anaerobically digest it and harvest the methane for electricity production. We also have our EcoDrop location, where we take paints, chemicals, electronics, light bulbs, hardcover books, things like that. And also residents can utilize the site if they don't want to have a curbside service, so they can bring their garbage and recycling directly to us. And finally, of course, we have our compost site. So this is a 13-acre site. We started operations in 1994, and we started marketing our compost in 1997. So all of our green waste comes from Oneida and Herkimer County residents and businesses. So about 2/3 of the municipalities that we service about 75 different towns and villages. About 2/3 of them use our site. Other municipalities operate their own compost site. So we're not the only composting center in the area, but we are probably one of the largest. So what you saw earlier that Sarah was showing you, these are our windrows. So I think we're going to walk back towards the grinder.
We did see a large piece of machine, and you mentioned
yes.
green waste. Can you define green waste for us as we're heading back to see what's going on?
Absolutely. So our site, we are permitted by the DEC to accept yard waste. So we don't take any food waste at this site for composting. So everything that we're accepting is going to be trees, shrubs, wood, grass clippings, Christmas trees like we saw in our last session. So things like that, they all come to our facility. We weigh them in on the scales to keep track of how much material we're taking in. And then they all go into this big pile that you guys are going to see up on your right. And what Steve is doing in that loader is he is scooping up all of the green waste, the brush, and putting it into our grinder.
So Dr. Chesky said that you wanted to do the balance of the 1084.
And we do have somebody, we're getting some feedback. So if you could please make sure that if you're not the presenter, if you can please just keep yourself muted. Thank you. So it looks like what's going on and what's the process, the first process that we're seeing?
Sure. So all the green waste after it comes across our scales is going to be overpiled into our brush pile here. Last time we saw it, it was quite a bit bigger. Now that the weather's getting better, we're catching up on that. So what Steve is doing in that loader is he's grabbing all the material and he's running it through this wood chipper. So it's kind of loud. We can get a little bit closer. And what that grinder does is it's shredding all of the material up into finer pieces. You can see it shooting out the side. It kind of looks like a mulch already. So this is a critical part of the composting process. We need the material to be in as fine of pieces as possible to allow the microbes, the surface area, to do their work, breaking that material down and turning it into that compost.
So we'll be discussing microbes later on in our virtual development, but is this something that you have to add, or is this something the microbes and decomposers, things that come naturally as you put the compost out?
That's a really good question. So nature kind of has solved this problem for us. So composting is nature's way of recycling. So everything you need for compost is right in that green waste. So the formula, if you will, for compost is you need carbon, which is going to be your browns or woody material, dry leaves, wood shavings. And then you need nitrogen, which is going to be your greens, which is fresh leaves, grass clippings, fresh brush. And after you chip all that material up, you need water and you need oxygen. And then nature kind of takes over and starts breaking that material down. So our job here is just to help nature do its job. And with the industrial equipment that we have, we're able to produce compost a little bit quicker than you would if you did this in your backyard, but anybody can do this at home. It doesn't take any special equipment. You really just need green waste and a barrel.
So I noticed you have some kind of instrument with you. Where do we go from the next
Yes.
step? Once it's been shipped, what's the next step in the process? And what's the instrument that you're holding?
All right, so let's walk back over to the windrows here. So after the material comes out of that chipper, what we're doing is we're putting all of that material in big long rows called windrows. So it covers almost the entire 13-acre site. We usually have about 17 windrows going. Right now, some of these windrows are done cooking, so we're overpiling them. But as you can see here, they're pretty tall. They're about maybe 8 feet wide, maybe 50 yards long, if I had to guess. And part of my job monitoring the site is using this compost thermometer. So this is my very, very long thermometer here. And what I do probably about once a week, I go up and down these rows and I'm inserting this probe into the compost pile. I'm trying to get as close to the center as I possibly can to get an accurate temperature reading. And the reason that that's important to monitor is if the compost gets too hot, they can actually catch on fire, which is not something that you really need to worry about in this part of the country because it's pretty wet around here. So the water really cools these piles down. But if you were out in, an arid location, you would want to keep an eye on that. My biggest thing in this area of the country is making sure they're not too cold. So if the piles get down to a certain temperature, the microbes don't have the energy to work and to do their job. So what we do at that point is I will tell some of the guys that work out here that we need to drive over these piles in a windrow turner, which I think we'll show you later on. So it literally straddles the pile, drives over it, and it has these big claws that kind of mix it up. And we're introducing oxygen, and that kind of reignites these microbes and gives them the energy that they need. So just like you and I, if we're gonna do any exercise or physical work, we need oxygen to be delivered to our muscles to give us the energy to do that. Microbes operate in the same way. So if they get too cold, we're gonna turn them. If it gets too hot, we can turn them as well, or add water. I've been working here for about 4 years. I've never seen that. But the hottest temperature I think I've ever seen is 190. And if it gets much higher than 200, then I might consider throwing a little water on there to cool it down.
So can you show us how the probe's used?
Yes. So what I do is I take 3 samples per row. So I walk up and down these rows. I try to get in a little bit from the end and I just push this in to the pile. And it takes a couple of minutes, 30, 40 seconds to kind of slow down. These piles are cooking. So it's about 60 degrees out here, I think. I wonder if it'll rise much more. Looks like it's still going there.
So is there a sweet spot for the temperature to make sure you have compost? Or is there a temperature that you want the compost to sit at?
Typically, we want the compost to be, maybe 50 to 60 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature, so warmer than it is just in the air. That means that, there's enough heat in the piles, and heat is a signal that the microbes are working. So they release heat when they're breaking the material down. So I would say about 50 to 60 degrees above just the ambient temperature.
So I do have a question. Why is it called a windrow?
I do not know the answer to that question. I apologize. I could probably look that up and find that out for you later, but I am not sure where that word comes from.
Well, I know when we're in agriculture, when we're doing hay, they like to put hay into rows to help dry and have that drying process. And I think also when we're doing things like corn and other things, they might stack in just a long row. So maybe it has something to do with just the way things are stacked. But so we have these long windrows. We've mulched this. Where do we go next?
So let's take a walk down past all these piles here. As I mentioned before, we can kind of speed up this process. So nature would break down the material that you saw in that brush pile. If you just left it there and you were good about turning it, monitored the temperatures, it would take about a year for that compost to be stable. So it's not fluctuating in temperature. That's a signal that the microbes are done doing all their work. And we're able to turn that raw material into a finished compost in about 3 months. So that's because of the industrial equipment that we have and how closely we monitor it. And after these piles are fully, it's all stable, temperatures are good, moisture levels good, what we do is we overpile it, and then we start running it through our screener, our trommel screen. So we're going to head over there so I can show you what that looks like. But what that basically is doing is it acts as like a sieve or a sifter for flour. So our trommel screen is suited to 1/2 inch. So we're trying to get out the big pieces that didn't get broken down. Most of the time it's chunks of wood. And any material that doesn't go through that screen, we have in a separate location, and we actually use it on site for construction. So because we have, these big loaders and the windrow turners, this industrial equipment, the pathways, the roads here kind of take a beating. So we use that larger pieces of the compost to fill in holes and make the roads a little bit more accessible.
So as you're headed towards the sifter, I do have a question from Andrea. She said, is there a temperature that is too hot for microbes where you should consider or you should worry about the microbial life dying off in your pile?
Yes. So thermophiles are the microbes that like the heat the most. And it's very important to get your compost up to at least 150 degrees for 1 or 2 days. This kills pathogens, bacteria, things that you don't want in your compost that could be harmful to the environment, to your plants. So you want it to at least be up to 150. If it gets above 200, your microbes aren't happy, and they might start to die off, like you said. But there are different kinds of microbes. Like I mentioned, the thermophiles. There's also mesophiles that kind of do most of the work. They're in that sweet spot, maybe 80 to 120 degrees, and they're the ones that are working the longest. But yeah, if it gets above 200, you might want to add some water to cool that down.
And if you do have any questions, please post them in chat, and we will definitely relay those to Samantha. So Samantha, we have chipped, we have composted. What process, where are we at in the process, and what is the next process or step in the process?
All right, so right here you see our trommel screen. Steve started that up for you. So we have material going through this spinning sifter, and it's pulling out all of we're closer to like the reject pile. So these are all the big pieces. There's some rocks in there. We do our best not to, but it's an outdoor site. So sometimes rocks get in there. The screen pulls all those out. And then over behind me, you can see all the fine material that made it through that screen. That's our finished compost. That's our black gold, as we call it. So we can take maybe a closer look at the inside of this equipment here, so you can see how it works.
So how long have these piles been sitting before you start to sift it?
So the windrows have, because we just came out of the winter, it's not quite as fast of a process. These windrows have been sitting for about 6 to 8 months. In the summer, the new ones that we're making now, like I said, those will be done in about 3 months. And this finished compost was we just turned the piles over. So this is fresh. I just checked the temperatures last week. They were good to go. So this is all from last fall, essentially.
So is there a temperature that you're looking for to know that the process has halted?
Basically what I'm looking for is temperature change. So if I check the temperatures 1 week and they're all between, 60, 70, and maybe it's 40 degrees outside, and I check again and they're all still 50, 60, 70 degrees, that's how I know that it's done. So it's not necessarily a specific temperature, it's whether or not the temperature is changing. So as long as that's remained stable for a while, then I feel confident that the material is ready.
And it looks like we have a load coming in.
Yes, we do. So that looks like our finished compost, I believe. Oh, I think he wants to get around you there. Oh, nope, he's pulling that off a windrow, so he's going to throw that through the screener for us.
And I do have a question. Where can we buy the long thermometers?
I think that I got this from Amazon, but I'm sure that, local places like Home Depot, Lowe's, any place like that would probably have these in stock, but I think I got mine from Amazon here.
And so how many, we noticed the compost going into the sifter, so it's sifting out the thicker from the finished compost and as you said, the rejects. How many people does it take to run your facility?
So we have 2 full-time employees that work out in compost, either screening, which is what Steve is doing right now, turning the rows, overpiling, adding material to the chipper. And then I am here kind of per diem to monitor the temperature in the site. So there's 2 full-time employees, and then I kind of drop in every once in a while.
So can we have Sarah get a shot of the reject end? We noticed there's a lot of great stuff coming out.
So they want to see a little bit of this reject pile, the bigger pieces here.
So we're noticing,
you can get a little closer.
We're noticing not a lot of product coming out of that end. So that must mean that it was composted pretty well.
Yep. So we want as little as possible to come out of the reject side. And that's why the grinder is so critical. We need to get the pieces down as small as possible before we start the process. If we didn't do that, this would take much longer. And so there are still some bigger chunks. Usually that is the outside layer of the pile. As you can imagine, as you go inside, that all those microbes have a better environment. It's moist, it's warmer, they can do their work a little better. So typically what's coming out of the tailings here is going to be like the shell of the compost, that hardened layer on the windrows, before you get down to where that material is breaking down good. And then you can see how big the finished pile is there of that fine compost.
And can we take a look at that finished pile?
Yes.
So as this is finished, what happens with these piles?
So this will be moved to a location closer to the road. And basically, you can buy compost from us in 2 ways. So we can either give the material to you in bulk. So you can bring down a pickup truck or a trailer. We will load you. So that's one of the full-time employees' jobs, to load trailers and pickup trucks that come down. It's $15 a cubic yard for our compost in bulk. And we also run quite a bit of the material through our baggers. So we have a bagger. I can't show you that today. We're not quite at that point in production yet. But we also sell the compost in bags. So they're about 1.2 cubic feet. They weigh about 40 pounds a piece. and we sell them $2 a bag or 3 for $5.
And can we get a up close shot of the finished compost?
Yeah, let's go a little closer to the finished pile here. So this is all that good stuff. It's been screened, totally broken down, and we're ready to either load up this material in your pickup trucks or run it through that bagger, and it's ready for your gardens.
And so you mentioned coming and picking up some compost. Are there other places that utilize your compost?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Are there other places that utilize your compost other than homeowners?
Yes, so we sell our compost to greenhouses. We sell our compost to landscapers. And we also sell our compost, typically the bagged compost, to retail locations that resell it themselves. So like a Lowe's or a Home Depot, they will purchase the bags of our compost and then they'll resell them to their customers, just to kind of, you know, widen the distribution of it. And we also sell a lot of compost for construction projects. So this is great soil amendment for your gardens. It's great for landscaping, but there's been a lot of construction in the area lately, and you can use this as backfill. So a lot of excavation projects, if they just need dirt to fill, you know, a hole to construct a building on top of, they utilize this for some construction projects in the area as well. So there's a lot of uses for compost.
So I have a question from Danielle, and she
Sure.
wants to know what happens to the reject pile.
So typically what we do with that is we use it for construction on site. So as you can see here, the compost area is kind of bumpy. It's not a smooth paved surface, so you got to wear your rain boots when you come out here. So usually what we'll do with that is we'll fill in holes just to give it, you know, a smoother surface, make it easier for homeowners to back their trucks in here. So we utilize it beneficially on site.
And I have another question from Joe. He wants to know, are there other counties that are doing this?
Yes, other counties operate their own compost programs, even other municipalities within our 2 counties. So like I said in the beginning, about 2/3 of the towns and villages in our 2 county area bring their green waste to this site. The other 1/3 operate their own compost programs. So it's a smaller scale what the municipalities are doing, but they just take all the green waste from their village or their town, and they do the same sort of thing on a smaller scale. So definitely, we're not the only compost site in the area, but we probably are one of the largest.
If I was wanting to create a school garden, would I be able to come and get compost from you?
Yes, absolutely. And on a case-by-case basis, we do donate some compost to certain programs. If you buy, you know, enough of the compost, we do offer discounts on that. We love to, you know, teach the kids about how to compost and get them set up. So definitely give us a call if you're interested in that, and we can try to work something out.
And before we let you go, if anybody has any final questions, please put them in chat. But if once things start to get back to normal, as a classroom, if I'm near Utica, can I come visit you?
Yes, absolutely. So we love to give tours, in-person tours. We miss that. We give tours of our recycling center. We give tours of the transfer station, our food to energy location, and of course the compost site, and even the landfill if you wanted to head up there. So yes, we are eager to get back into that as soon as it's safe. We would love to have people come down and visit us. So absolutely reach out.
And the last question, would it be possible to have somebody from the authority come visit my classroom as things start to open up?
Definitely. So we love to do that as well. Primarily, we service Oneida and Herkimer counties. So if you're too far out of that jurisdiction, we would probably refer you to another solid waste authority that does the similar thing. But we can always do virtual tours as well. But if you're in Oneida and Herkimer counties, absolutely, we would love to come to the classroom and kind of do this, but inside and teach the kids about how this all works. So definitely.
Well, thank you so
Hopefully
much.
soon.
Well, yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much for having us out once again. I know the authority has a lot of great resources, and we will be sharing that information out in a follow-up email here in the next few days, as well as Samantha's contact, so that if teachers want to get a hold of you, that they are able to get a hold of you. So Samantha, thank you so much for having us. Please tell Steve thank you for driving the machines for us, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too. Thanks for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much for Jeremiah and Samantha and our colleague Sarah, who's on site today. We really enjoyed that experience of getting to view that compost site. But we're going to, before we move on to our next piece, we just want to take a quick look at the Padlet that you all filled out. So we have so many wonderful people. If we were all together, we get to learn a whole lot about everyone's programs and what their hopes and aspirations are, and gain some inspiration from one another. So as we transition, we just want to take a quick look and maybe talk to some people about what they're doing. So I know there are some great programs on here. So I was wondering, Melinda, if you wouldn't mind unmuting. Melinda's one of our teachers, and I just thought we'd pick on a few people to talk about what they, based on what you've written in your Padlet and kind of what we know about you. Melinda, would you mind talking a little bit about your tower gardens that you have? So a tower garden is an aeroponic system, kind of like what's behind me here. Would you want to talk about what you do with your classes?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it. So this year, I'm still working with Tiffany, and she had a 12-on-1 room, and now all of those students are in all of the classes. So that's kind of exciting. And so this year, I've actually been growing some soybeans in the tower gardens, and we're looking at the genetically modified soybeans and the not genetically modified soybeans, which was a kit that was given to me by Katie when we went to the National Ag in the classroom. So that's kind of exciting. We definitely talk about like the food webs and how energy is transferred through the system. We have 3 tower gardens. We actually have one in an English classroom as well too. And we read in 8th grade, they read Omnivore's Dilemma. So we have a lot of things going on. We've been trying to make it work this year with our hybrid program. We have some of the students in the classroom and some remotely. So we're making it work.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a great job. So we hope you're gaining some inspiration. Feel free to put chats on people's introductions, or if you have something you want to add about the awesome things you're doing. I'm going to pick on Steve next. Steve, are you free? I know he's got some pretty cool construction going on or starting soon. Do you want to talk about your high tunnel?
Sure, yeah, we got all of our stuff in. I don't know, can you guys hear me? Any thumbs up?
Yep, you're
okay,
good.
Right.
We
You might
can hear
hear
you.
a
Good to
dog
see
barking or kids yelling or something like that. Oh, there the dogs. So yeah, we got a high tunnel all in pieces. We're gonna start it in late spring here, or even in the summer, and we're ready to take over the entire courtyard with some production of lettuce and strawberries. We're gonna go for everything, and it goes right into we have a culinary class that just started at the middle school, and we also have we're big into the farm to school. We know we're never gonna be self-sustaining and create all of our own food, but at least we're gonna try, and we're gonna get students that experience and stuff like that. So yeah, we got a big project ahead of us. We're working on it.
Well, we love your gumption. I can't wait to see what you come up with, and I can't wait to get back out to Western New York. That's for sure. Finally, I just want to pick on Sue in Lowville. Would you mind talking about what you've been doing lately out in the village of Lowville?
Sure. I attended the Maple session a couple of weeks ago, and I brought it back to my students, and we this year have 10 teachers on our grade level so that we could all be in person. And just about all of those other teachers have participated. I partnered with our ag teacher, Mel Phelps, And he took us out and we tapped trees near school, and he let all of the kids each have a role in the process. So that was really fun. Collected it. I actually brought home a little bit of the syrup and boiled it down on my stove and had 2 tiny little jars. But we did a taste test and they loved it. They really, really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, we appreciate you sharing about that. I'm based in Lowville as our office. So I love driving home and seeing all your awesome bags out collecting sap through town. We're going to pause there. We're trying to find really great, innovative, fun ways for you all to talk about your projects and connect a little bit more. So if you have any great suggestions for sharing more of that or have questions for anyone on their posts, we encourage you to do that. So with that, I think we're going to move into our first lesson. So I'm going to pass it back over to Jeremiah.
Well, welcome back, I'm glad to be back with you. If you notice, I noticed there was a question about Tower Gardens, and I don't know if you can see behind me, I'm hooked up, but it's an aeroponics tower garden. We do offer a grant for these. And I have down there at the bottom, I have some tomatoes. In the middle, you can't really see them, but some wheat growing. Try to do something a little funky and fun, and some lettuces and chard and basil there at the top. So I am here in Inlet, New York, which is in the heart of the Adirondacks. We are a zone 3. So for us to be able to grow, we really don't have much agriculture. So it's very difficult here in the Adirondacks, as we're going to learn here in a minute, to be able to grow things. One of those issues, of course, is our climate being zone 3. The other issue is soil. So I am glad to join you today. I want to quickly talk about the notes that we shared with you, or the videos we shared with you on taking notes. This is a journal that I set up with my students. I want to look at this reflective piece before we go forward. So whenever we had lessons, we always had our students rate themselves 0 through 4 to really show us their understanding of whatever objective that we're trying to meet in the lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, we'd always have them rate themselves. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have created a quick chart, and I would like for y'all all to rate yourself. The objective that we're going to meet today is how well do you understand the science of composting and soil science. And I am not getting, let me try one more time. Are y'all able to see that? Or are you still seeing me, Katie?
You should be
so
good.
if you could rate yourself, 0 being no knowledge, 1 is I'm very unclear, 2 is a brief understanding, 3 I have a full understanding, and 4, of course, the highest level of knowledge is being able to teach. So if you could just post your rating here at the beginning of the lesson in chat, and then we can go back and revisit that at the end of the lesson. So we sent y'all a kit with quite a few different things to it, and I want to first take a look at some of the soil in the kit. So if you could pull out your soil. And we asked you to pull out a piece of paper. You might want to set that paper. We're going to dump a little bit of that soil. So the first, we have 3 bags. And I will let y'all guess what these 3 bags are. So we have 2 little snack bags and a gallon bag. So can anybody guess in chat what you think we sent you in these bags?
And Jeremiah, would you be able to stop your screen sharing so that your
Yep.
video feed could be perfect? Thank you.
So what do you think are in these bags? And I will dump out this first bag. And it's pretty loose grained. So any guesses what this first soil is? And so I would like for you, if you can grab it, always within our classrooms, we want to use our senses. So if you can smell, and notice if you have any smell to that. And it is pretty loose grain. You can see that there's very little organic material in this. So this first bag would be sand. So the second sack bag, if you could smell. And if you could spread it out on your paper, you're going to notice it's quite moist. Any guesses what the second one is? So the second is compost. This is unsifted compost. As you can notice, as you pick through, we wanted to send you unsifted compost because we wanted you to really notice the different materials that we have in it. You might find some eggshells, you might find some twigs, definitely some leaves. And then the last bag, which is the gallon bag, if you could open that up and smell. This is a special treat, and this has a story that goes along with it. When we were trying to start a school garden here most recently, one of the issues that we faced was that people thought that we could not grow. And we discussed that early on, climate is an issue here in the Adirondacks, but also soil. So if you notice, there's quite a bit of organic material in it. Quite a few of y'all probably have some roots, but this is our Adirondack soil. So we wanted to send you a bag of Adirondack soil because this really captures the issues that are faced when we're talking about agriculture, is that our soil is very important to us and it's very alive. So with our students, we always presented anytime we had an obstacle, it was a new opportunity. So what we did is we started our compost program at the school. We started to collect the coffee grinds and leaves and stuff from the neighborhood and started building our own soils. We actually did get a shipment from the authority. And we wanted to send you this Adirondack soil because we think this captures the issues that we are seeing around the country in many places and around the world, is when we overutilize our soils in that we don't give back to the soils. So we wanted to give you the soil as we're looking into this lesson on composting, because we wanted to give you a challenge and your students a challenge. You have a poor soil, so what can we do to start to enrich this soil? And one of the answers is composting. So the next thing that we included in your bag or in your kit is bags. And we ask for y'all to start to save any of the byproducts that we have from your last 3 lunches. And we want to start to create a layer. So we will be sending you this lesson when we're done with here in the next few weeks. And this is a lesson from our lesson matrix. And we want our students to recognize the process of decomposition. And you can see I left a few little pieces in this bag. This is foam. And I wanted to leave those in there because I want my students to really start understanding the difference between something that is compostable and something that isn't compostable. So if you could bring out any of the leftovers that you have from your lunch, and you can grab a bag, and we are going to start to layer our bags. And I'll give everybody a second to collect those. So one of the things that Samantha identified when we were with her on the field trip is that we need greens and browns. Somebody has their volume on. So you're going to need greens and browns. Greens, carbon, are dried materials, dry planting materials, woody materials. Carbon helps to sustain life and is important in sustaining. So what we'd want our students to do is we'd want them to start to shred their paper. And it's also important, as Samantha discussed, is that things need to be moist. We provide you with a spray bottle so that students can spray down their compost because those microbes need the water as well as the oxygen. And we're going to have our students start to layer their bags. So the next important aspect are things that are green. So we look at this lettuce and a piece of bacon. This is a great example of something that we don't want. This is compost from our local, or scraps from our local coffee shop. We try to keep meats and dairies out of our compost because they have a smell and they'll go rancid, but they can also bring critters like mice. And here in the Adirondacks, we have that piece of bacon out. We definitely have a bear sniffing around after waking up from the winter. So our greens are things that are fresh, that have a lot of nitrogen in them. So we want to start to layer those with our browns. Now, when we mention greens and browns, it doesn't always have to deal with color. So if we take a look at a piece of tomato, we have an avocado shell. This has a lot of nitrogen in it, and this is what's going to cause those microbes to get really excited. It's going to start to create, it's going to help them with digestion and creating the acids that they need inside to digest and process the browns. So we want to be able to layer those greens and browns. Possibly one of my favorite is coffee. So can anybody take a guess what coffee is? Is it a green or a brown? And you can put it in chat. Is coffee a green or a brown? And I'm seeing quite a few people identifying coffee as a brown. A few greens in there. So coffee is a green. It is high in nitrogen. And so don't get thrown off by colors. But we're thinking about nitrogen. It's an easy rule of thumb to say, oh, that's green. We can throw in grass clippings. We can throw in our garden clippings that we have just clipped. They're going to have all that nitrogen that they're going to want to release. Nitrogen is released pretty quickly, and things start to convert to carbon and lose their nitrogen pretty quickly. So as those, within a few weeks, you're going to start to see if you had spread your grass out, you're going to start to see it turn brown and become a carbon. That nitrogen is going to get released into the atmosphere. Once things die, nitrogen moves through the cycle. So coffee grinds are a green. One thing that you have to notice, I pulled out a nice clump. You can notice this was somebody's amazing latte, which is going to make me some amazing tomatoes later on in the season. And what's great is when you introduce students to composting, they think it is the most disgusting thing. A lot of them. You have some of those kids that are going to think it's awesome. And so as you introduce these things to them, they're really going to start to get into it and really start to handle it. And that's what we like to see. We say if you don't have dirt underneath your fingernails, then we haven't done enough that day. And that was our mantra. So if you notice with coffee grinds, it clumps up, and that is something that you need to be careful with if you're adding them to your worm farm that we'll discuss later on, or if you're adding them into your bag. And that's an experiment that you can do as you're rolling these bags out with your students. We gave you enough bags to pair up for 30 students. When you get the lesson, there is a file for the composting lesson. And what you'll do is you'll have one student be able to record what ingredients they are putting in. And then the other student will you'll draw what they're putting in, we'll list it, we can even color code it, and then you'll want to switch and have the other student add the greens to it. So as you go through the lesson, you will start to identify what browns and greens are. We did also give you enough soil that we wanted you to be able to use the soil and put into your bag. So another great experiment would be, once you have worked with your students to start to identify the different types of soils, is that you could create 3 different bags to see how things would decompose. So if I added the sand to one bag, I added the compost to one bag, and I added the grade A Adirondack soil to another bag, and really be able to record if there's a difference in that decomposition. We would expect, because the soil is full of nutrients and full of microorganisms, that the bag with the compost would really start to break down sooner. So we also have a few other lessons to go with this. Does anybody have any questions before we go any further? And if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, or you can just put it in the chat.
Well, as you're thinking about some questions, we still have a whole lot of compost to talk about, but now is a great time to stand up and stretch your legs. I am going to show you just some great resources and tools that where you can find these tools. We're going to send you the direct link to the lesson that Jeremiah was just exploring, and along with our other lesson that we're building today. But this is our New York Agriculture in the Classroom website, and this website houses probably the most important and awesome thing that we can offer you as teachers. Right under the rotating pictures, you can see this blue box here. And in this blue box is our National Agricultural Literacy Matrix. This is an online resource of the best lessons from across the country. Every lesson has been vetted by a team of ag literacy specialists, and it's all keyword searchable. So I'm just going to pop in the word compost. we're going to show you what these lessons look like. So there's the rotten truth. This is a lesson that Jeremiah was just showing you. So we had questions about a student-friendly list or an already made list. There's tons of cool resources out there. You'll see here in this lesson, what's really nice about these lessons is they're super comprehensive. So even if you don't feel like you are a compost expert, and sometimes you're not sure what's a green and what's a brown, and especially when I was living in Ithaca and there were so many different bins that you had to choose from and figure out where your lunch remnants went, you are going to feel confident talking about compost and recycling with your students, going through the resources that are available. So you'll see there was lots of different resources. We have advanced search options, so you can search by your grade level, the type of resource you're looking for, what subject area, even by Common Core standards. So this is built out for you. You're going to see for this lesson all the materials you need. All your essential files are already made for you. So if you're looking at a different lesson and it references a PowerPoint, that PowerPoint is already done for you. And you can download that. It has your vocab words, all your background information here about different types of composters and your browns and your greens, as Jeremiah was discussing, and then digs deep into your procedures. Of course, enriching activities. Here are suggested companion resources. So along with those 500 already made for you lessons, there are about 800 companion resources and ever growing. So it's kind of like Amazon, where it's like, oh, you like this? You might also like this. So they give you some multimedia resources, books, just websites, standalone activities that you may also like. And then down here, you can see has your Common Core requirements. So if your administrator is asking why there are drills going in your classroom in the hands of your third graders, you can show them just why they have those resources, or why you're digging through the garbage. So those tools are all there for you. So the Matrix is an excellent resource for anything you're looking for related to food and agriculture. And you can also explore our website for our virtual field trip opportunities and more. So are there any questions? Sorry, I'm seeing a couple chat things. Oh, thank you, Jenny, for sharing that link. Yeah, and you'll get a direct link to our tools and resources. So yeah, feel free to dig in. If you just search the word soil, you're going to come up with more than you ever wanted to know about soil. It's a pretty popular topic in agriculture, as you might imagine. So at this point, I am really excited to introduce our next guest speaker. We have with us Bill Richmond, and he is the owner of the Adirondack Worm Farm. And we have been interacting with Bill on Instagram for many, many years. And he always puts out the best content. So if you are on Instagram, you will definitely want to follow him because there's always great content. But his worm farm is really unique. And we are really pleased to be able to have him with us today as our guest to talk about his model, to talk about vermicomposting and the things he's learned along the way. So Bill, I have made you a host. You should be able to share, and I'm going to pass along the power over to you to take over and give us your presentation.
Thank you very much, Katie. I appreciate that. And thank you all for taking some time to learn about composting worms. Just going to give a brief overview here and then get into some real concrete details about how to have a worm farm and be successful with it. So first, just overall, vermiculture is the phrase in terms of, working with worms. Vermicomposting is the process, but vermiculture involves vermicomposting or raising worms for fishing as bait worms or anything along those lines. So just a brief, quick overview and introduction to Adirondack Worm Farm. We use red wiggler composting worms. There's about a handful, about a half dozen or so composting worms, and the red wigglers are the most forgiving in terms of they handle the widest temperature range and the widest circumstances in the bin and still do okay. We also offer a curbside composting service. So we provide in the Glens Falls area here near where we are, for customers that want to compost but don't want to do it themselves or live in an apartment and can't do it. We offer that service here. We also have European night crawlers. We started in 2019, but have been working with worms for more than 5 years now. So just a quick overview and introduction. As I said, vermiculture relates to raising and cultivating worms. Vermicomposting is using worms. You can do the same exact thing as what we saw earlier on a large scale with worms, with a few caveats and things, but they basically do the same work, and they work pretty closely with the microbes. But you can do this. There's a lot more flexibility in many ways when you're composting with worms than when you're doing the larger process, and we'll go through some of those details. The red wigglers, as I mentioned, these are composting worms that live in the top few inches of soil, and they feed on the decaying organic matter. So you can't just go out after a rainstorm and pick up some worms that are on the sidewalk or your driveway. Those are not the kind of worms that would do well in a worm bin. And this is an image of a red wiggler, and you see the cocoon there. Red wigglers actually lay cocoons, and then babies hatch from that, little tiny worms, 3 to 5 worms from each cocoon hatch. Overall, the reason for looking at either composting traditionally or using vermicompost process is looking at the large landfills. And I'll kind of go through this a little bit quickly, but basically a third of the materials, 30 to 40% of residential household garbage is biodegradable. And a third of food that's produced is wasted either from the field where it just goes to rot and it's never harvested, or there's just no market for it, or it gets thrown out at the grocery store because it didn't sell, all the way to where people forget something in the back of the fridge and it goes bad on them. And landfills are a huge source of methane, which is an impact on climate change. So the fertilizer issue, a lot of farmers have to use fertilizer, and the US has lost quite a bit of farmland. All the time, there's more farmland going away, there's less open space. And so farmers have to use smaller acreage to produce the same or more amount of crops. So they rely quite a bit on the synthetic fertilizer. 50% of the nitrogen in that fertilizer generally is wasted based on a past study. And the problem is that the nitrogen is not something that's easily taken up by the plants. And vermicompost sort of provides nitrogen in a better way. I'll mention that soon. The problem with having too much nitrogen in your fertilizer is that because the plants can't take up what they need readily, the manufacturers have to put more in there. But when it rains, you got runoff, and now you have contamination of groundwater issues. So how do you do this? How do you use less cropland to grow more materials without chemicals? And vermicompost is a small part of the solution. This is a picture of red worms in dryer lint. Now, just as a caveat, a lot of clothes have some synthetic material in it, and the worms won't break that down. But if you've got cotton t-shirts or denim jeans or anything that was made from any kind of plant-based material, that lint in your dryer at some point was alive and can be composted by worms. This is a all natural and 100% recycled process. And you can even use the vermicast, the castings from the worm, to make a worm tea that you can use without any concern for runoff or burning your plants. This is a picture of our large flow-through bin that we have in our barn. And you can see it's not festive time for the worms. Those are old Christmas rope lights that, when I say old, they were let off as much heat as they do light. So we put those in. My brother-in-law was going to throw them away. He was upgrading to fancier, more LED efficient lights. But these work great. They, inside the bin, provide just enough heat, and the silver coating you see is insulation on the outside of the bin. And in our property in Washington County, we're able to keep the worms with just this little bit of insulation inside an unheated barn. They survive through the winter. They get a little chilly, but they don't die off. On a smaller scale, most folks will use a Rubbermaid tote of some sort to raise their red wigglers and compost in the house, which is why, in many ways, there's a benefit here versus the broader hot composting thermophilic process that we were talking about earlier. You want it to be something that's opaque because the worms don't like light, so you don't want to make it difficult for them and always be stressing them out. And if you can, you want a lid on there because that will help regulate your moisture level. And this bin, you see, we've got some bedding in there. It's strips of newspaper and office paper, a couple of paper towels and things like that as sort of the bedding. So the question then is vermicompost safe because you're using some rotting food? And again, as Jeremiah said earlier, with worm bins similar to small scale traditional composting, you don't really want to use meats and dairy and things like that. But if you're putting, broccoli that's gone bad or a salad that's wilted, that's not something that you'd want to eat. Of course, it's going to make you sick. So if the worms are processing it, is the end result safe or not? And there was a study in 2001 in Florida that looked at using actually wastewater biosolids. So basically sewage sludge. And they found an 8.6 log reduction in salmonella and a 6.4 log reduction in fecal coliform. The worms and the microbes actually turn those pathogens, they consume them as predators. And so those pathogens are dramatically reduced. I will admit, and probably some of you folks that are better at math than I am may understand this, but I didn't know what an 8.6 log reduction or 6.4 log reduction meant. It's basically the equivalent of that many nines. So 99.9999% reduction or even more than that. Okay, so how does vermicomposting help and the castings that you get at the end? It provides a slow release of the nutrients. So you're not going to have really high NPK levels like you would if you bought a bag of fertilizer and it was 10 10 10 or something like that. These numbers are going to be much lower in terms of those nutrients, but they are in a more bioavailable form and they are slow release. So throughout the season, they keep feeding the roots of the plants. And you can see here a Washington State University extension test that they did with carrots. One on the left had no vermicasting. The one in this middle had about 10% by volume from the soil that they were working with, and the one on the right had 20%. So you don't even need very much of this material to get some really dramatic results. And we did a test with our material here with a neighbor who's an avid gardener, and he set up a pot of pepper seedlings, a flat of them. On the left side, he just used the potting soil mix. On the right side, that same potting soil mix, but mixed in with 15% vermicompost. And that's the result he saw just after 6 weeks with the seedlings. And we continued that over the course of the growing season, and he continued to see much better results when using the vermicompost or the vermicast. Some of the differences between the regular, which is the more traditional hot composting process that we're seeing earlier. The vermicompost is a mesophilic process versus the thermophilic process of hot composting. And the vermicomposting process you can do in a continuous fashion. You just continue to add food as the worms consume that and work that into castings. And then you add some more food and bedding and you keep moving forward with that. So you can have a bin going for a year or more and continually process material. On the hot compost outdoor process, you really want to set it up once and have a batch. You want to collect your greens and your browns, put them in the right ratio, get the right oxygen and moisture content, and then you turn that, but you're not going to keep adding new material as that's processing. The vermicompost is about 60 to 90 days. Traditional compost can be as quick as 2 months, and commercial places do it fairly quick, but it can be 2 years if you're looking at your backyard compost pile. Both of them need the right amount of moisture. And on the vermicompost, another benefit is you can process more material in a smaller space and you can do it indoors. A worm bin does not smell if you're doing it right. On the traditional compost, obviously you're not going to do that in a classroom or in a laundry room or something like that. You need to do that outside. You need a lot of space for that. This is not, Dr. Bill's greatest thing ever. It's not some, miracle thing that no problems of no limitations of any sort. So let's talk about some of those. What you get on the end process depends on what you put on the inside. When you're starting with the materials, the feedstock and the bedding that you use for your worm bin. is going to depend on the quality of what you get out as castings. No matter what you use, castings are going to be beneficial. But if you're using dairy manure as your bedding and feed material, you're going to have a better quality material for castings in the end than if you're just using shredded cardboard and banana peels, for example. So that nutrient value is going to depend on what you're feeding the worms. And again, as I said, you can't readily compare this in terms of what you would see in a traditional fertilizer for NP and K. It has to remain moist and oxygenated at all times, otherwise your microbes start to die. You can store it if you have the right conditions. You can store it for up to a year, but really the fresher stuff is easier to work with. And when do you need it most? In the springtime when you're planting. When is it hardest to produce this stuff on a large scale, at least? In the winter when it's cold. So there's some difficulties there. And the worm tea that I mentioned before is really beneficial and can really stretch the use of your castings in a large garden area, but it's perishable. It's a cold brew oxygenated process. And if you don't use it within about 4 hours of it being finished, and it takes about 2 days of percolating to get it where you want it to be, you're going to start to have issues with that. So it's great stuff, but it's not something that works well on the shelf and use it when you want it. So how do you produce vermicompost? As I said, you need the right type of worm. There's about 9,000 species of worms in the world and only about 6 or so that are composting worms. You need the right kind of home for them, and you can actually use a lot of different processes if you have the space and the number of worms and such, but the tote bins really are what most folks will use on an indoor process. Bedding and food, which I'll talk about in a moment, moisture, and you need some patience. The biggest problem for new worm bin owners is that they overfeed their worms, and then that leads to some problems in the bin. And you don't want to disturb them too often. They don't really like the light, as mentioned. So if you're constantly taking the lid off and always going through there, you're going to disturb them, and it's just going to slow down their process because they need to settle back down to start consuming the food again and be comfortable. You want a neutral pH in the bin, which is fairly easy to maintain, but you don't want to put in a lot of acidic material. So not too much in terms of citrus products. You don't want a lot of orange peels or grapefruit and things like that in there. And the temperature for worms, they like it the same way that we do. 60 to 80 degrees is really ideal for worms. Anything much above 90, they start to really risk dying. Anything in below the mid 30s, they're going to start dying. And, you know, in the 40s and 50s, they're going to be really slow. And in the 80s to 90, they're going to be really slow. They are, however, pretty much self-sufficient. So you can leave them alone. So if you have a classroom worm bin and you've got, a winter break or something like that, nobody needs to babysit the worms. You know, you can put in a feed, make sure you've got good bedding in there, leave them alone. They'll be more than happy to process that stuff and be ready for you when you come back. They also self-regulate. So they're smart enough to know how much food are we getting on a regular basis? How much room do we have in our bin? And we're not going to overpopulate and then risk starving. So when you start with a small number of worms in a bin, the population will grow, and it'll grow pretty quickly, but it's not going to outgrow your bin. So what you end up, if you want to start a second bin, once your bin is pretty chock full of worms, you would split that and take half the worms and put them in a new bin, and then they'll start to populate to the extent you want for that bin, and the first one the same thing. But you're not going to be overrun with worms if you don't want to be. One of the coolest things that I really think is just fascinating is when worms produce the cocoons for the next generation, those cocoons take about 21 days to hatch. If the conditions are such that the baby worms are likely to die if they hatch, the cocoon will go into a form of stasis and they just simply won't hatch. So if it's too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry, they'll just sit there. And the cocoons are not indestructible, but they can handle a much broader range of conditions than actual live worms. And when the conditions improve, they'll hatch. Basic care here, and I'm going through this kind of quickly so we have time for some questions and such, but bedding is along the same lines as the carbon, the brown materials that were talked about for the traditional composting: shredded paper, shredded cardboard, leaves, aged grass clippings, and livestock manure, but I'm not sure you want to use that with students in the classroom, but it's a good bedding and food material. Food, fruit peels, pits, cores, stems, and seeds. You know, banana peels are goods, apple cores, anything that you might have. Again, try to stay away from citrus a little bit, just so that you don't throw off the pH of your bin. Melon rinds are great, watermelon, cantaloupe. Pumpkin is one of redworm's favorite foods. Used coffee grounds are good, even the filters, as long as they're paper-based and not plastic. Tea bags. Your vegetable peelings, carrots, carrots, and anything like that you have. Onions, maybe you want to stay away from. Corn cob husks are great. The leftover items in the fridge, fruits and vegetables that are going bad, and eggshells are excellent. You can put them in just as they are after you use the egg, or you can crush them down into a fine powder, and that serves as a nice grit for the worms. Some of the things you want to avoid for bedding or food, glossy magazines, you don't want that. If you have paper, you want to make sure you shred it, not the whole sheets, because that will mat down and cause anaerobic conditions and keep the oxygen levels low. I've already talked about citrus and strong odor items like garlic and onions. Meat and dairy, you want to stay away from that. And nothing that's particularly acidic or vinegar based. So, stay away from the pickles and things like that. As I said, 60 to 80 degrees, dark, moist, and leave them alone to the extent you can. You can check on them every day, that's fine. But if it's like every hour or two, that's getting to be a bit much. And if you can do it every couple of days or once a week, even better. You want to make sure that the bin has air holes in it. And the best way to do that is actually to have some air holes in the side. And I know Jeremiah said they sent you guys bins, so I don't know if that's been done or not, but you want to make sure that you have air holes in the bins. And so what's the moisture level that you want for your bin? It's equivalent to laundry coming out of the spin cycle, heading into the dryer. You know it's wet, but you can't really wring much liquid out of that. So some of the benefits, just overall, you're diverting waste from landfills. It's easier. You can do it all year round without any issues. You don't have to go out in the snow compared to traditional composting. And it's not particularly expensive to get started, especially on a small scale, and your worms will reproduce pretty quickly, so you can grow that. And on the back end, you can get more vibrant seedlings, and plants grown with castings actually are more disease resistant than those that are grown without. Not just healthier, but they actually are able to fend off various diseases and pests. And on the larger scale, to go back to the initial point where I was talking about farmers and the issues with their inorganic fertilizer, you can grow larger crop yields year after year on the same plot of land using castings, because you are replenishing the nutrients that the plants are taking out. So I hope that wasn't too quick, but I wanted to give you guys all an overview, and I'll stop sharing here and let you see if there's any questions.
That was wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much. Danielle does have a question. Is chicken waste a good bedding?
Chicken waste is dangerous because it's very high in nitrogen. It's very hot. So if you really let it age for quite a while, it might be okay, but I would steer away from it, especially for a new worm farmer.
It looks like Julie has a question. Feel free to unmute, Julie.
Hi. So I have a worm bin in my classroom. I have a bin, and I just recently purchased, I have a solar powered box to put outside and a hand crank to put inside, a big hand crank. When I start those bigger sessions, those bigger settings for the composting, should I also just use the bedding of shredded newspaper and paper, and then go with the greens and the worms, or is there a different way to do it if it's like it's not the box?
Yeah. When you say a hand crank, is that like a compost tumbler?
Yes, yes, a
Okay.
compost tumbler.
Yeah. Those are really meant more for traditional composting. I mean, you could put worms in there, but you're going to get them jostled up a lot, and worms don't like vibration. So probably not ideal to use a compost tumbler for a worm bin.
Okay, so no worms in the tumbler, but the solar powered box, which is basically like a fancy cedar box with some grating on the bottom and then a solar on top so that it could heat up quicker?
No, that I'm not familiar with that one, but the worms, you don't want the worms getting too hot because you'll start cooking them and they'll get up well past 80 degrees. If
Okay.
it's more to try to get some winter sun to keep it from freezing or something, that might work. I'm not really familiar with that, but generally in upstate New York, it's going to be difficult to keep worms outside and throughout the year.
I'm probably the only downstate person. I'm
Oh.
New York City here. So I'm trying different things. So those two you wouldn't recommend for the vermicomposting. You would just use the outside, like a traditional outside to set up for the compost, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to say no on the one with the solar panel because I'm not really familiar with that. Definitely on the compost tumbler, I would not use that with worms.
Thank you.
So Bill, we do have a question from Megan, and she's mentioned a colleague had a worm bin years ago and it attracted some insects. Any suggestions for minimizing that issue? And just as a note, Sarah said freeze your food waste then thaw, and she hasn't had any problems with bugs. Do you have any other insect repellent ideas that you could pass along?
Yes, freezing would work, but if you take the material that you're going to feed them and bury it under some new bedding, or dig a little bit of a hole in the bedding, put the material, the food in there, and then cover that over, that should prevent any, or very much limit any potential for fruit flies and things like that.
Excellent. What other questions do we have for Bill? We have his expertise here.
The one thing I will tell you, because it comes up a lot, is, okay, great, I have a worm bin, it worked, we've been at it for most of the year, let's say most of the school year. How do we get the castings out? There's a number of different ways to do that. If you have some sort of screen or sifter, you can use that. You can just make a small handheld one and sift out the castings from the worms. A really simple way is the light method, which is you dump all the contents of the bin out on a table of some sort with a light over it, and the worms will dig inside the pile because they don't like the light. And then you scrape off the edges of your mound. You're getting your castings and anything that wasn't processed. Once you start to see some worms, leave it again for maybe another 10 minutes or so. Those worms that you were starting to see will burrow deeper into the pile. Come back in 10 minutes, scrape the next section off. When you see worms, repeat this process, and eventually you'll have all the castings and unprocessed material off to the side, and you'll just have your ball of worms in the center.
Julie, did you have another question?
Oh, yes, I was just about to type it. In terms of mixing with the soil, so now you have your castings and you have your compost. What's the best way to mix it in with the soil before you then put it in a planting situation?
If you are using a potting soil mix or something that you're working with, just put about 10 to 15% by volume and just mix it with your hands. If you're putting it on an existing bed or on your garden, on the ground outside, you're going to want to sprinkle it on the top, and then just lightly water that in, and that should be sufficient. You could also, if you have larger, a lot of vineyards are using vermicast now, and what they do is they take about a cup of castings and put it right at the base of that vine, and then let that sort of get watered in, and then go to the next plant, put a cup there. And so if you have larger bushes or plants, you can put some right at the base. If you're going to be planting just generally outdoors, you want to just sprinkle it across the top and then water it in. You don't really want to, you can rake it in a little, but really it's better to just water it in some.
So we just have a few more questions left. So Charles wants to know, could you explain how you make the vermi-tea?
Yes, what you're doing is you're actually growing microbes. So the worms get all the credit, but it's really the microbes that are doing most of the heavy lifting here. So you take some castings, and just as an example, for a 5-gallon bucket, if you took about a cup to a cup and a half of castings, put it in something like a nylon bag or something that's breathable and is going to get water coming through, but not put out all of the castings out into the water. And then you agitate that water in some fashion. I mean, the way that we do it is we have an air pump and we have some pipes set up, but you can just stir it up a little bit. The simplest method is to take maybe I don't know, a couple of teaspoons or an eighth of a cup of castings, put it in a 2-liter soda bottle, put water in there, make sure that it's not tap water from a city that might chlorinate their water. So either well water, or if it's chlorinated, let it sit in an open container and not, the chlorine will evaporate. And then you put the water in there, you put some of the castings in there, you leave the lid of this soda bottle or whatever you have off because you want oxygen being there. Screw the lid on, shake it up to get that, make sure that you're getting that oxygenation throughout the whole liquid. Take the lid back off, leave it there, do that, a couple of times a day over the course of 1 or 2 days. And then you can just pour that muddy liquid out on your plants and it'll work perfectly.
And Megan wants to know, she heard that there's an invasive species of worms that are not good for root development and can harm live plants. Is that the red wigglers?
No, there are Asian jumping worms, they're called, or some blue worms. Those have been seen to be an issue, not red wigglers. Red wigglers really won't survive very well in North America. Maybe somewhere in the southern regions, but they need to live in the top couple of inches of soil. So they're not going to burrow deep down below the frost line. And when they get a freeze, it's going to kill them. And again, while cocoons can survive down into the, the 30s or maybe even the mid 20s, they're certainly not going to survive much colder than that, and not for extended periods of time. So you can't really, like, some people have said, well, what if I just get a bunch of red wigglers and put them in my garden bed? That'll work for the season, but you're going to quickly lose your red wigglers over the winter. So red wigglers have not been found to be an invasive species, but yes, there is a blue worm that is.
Well, Bill, our final question is, our teachers are wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your great presentation that you shared.
Sure, I could send that around. If you guys want to use something with your class or something like that, that's fine. I just ask that it not just be shared out publicly on social media or something like that. But yes.
Oh, you are so kind. You had such great information for them about starting a program. And so you will also get the recording. It's a private link that we'll share with all of you. So you'll get that in our follow-up. So you'll be able to reference all these great questions also. Bill, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your amazing knowledge with us. Vermicomposting is just one of those things that teachers love to do with their students. So I know I saw lots of great note-taking happening. So thank you for inspiring our teachers to keep up their vermicomposting bin, and hopefully they'll get a chance to follow you on your social media because you do such a bang-up job.
Thank you all. I appreciate the interest.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, this is your time where you get a chance just to stretch your legs. Go ahead and gather all your materials that you need for the second half. Jeremiah can remind you of all the items that you need to have ready for this next lesson we're going to experience.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. That was fascinating. I know that we, part of the kit, we sent you some worms. Hopefully they're still still alive. If not, please enjoy those. As Katie mentioned in the chat, we will be sending y'all some red wigglers here in the next few weeks. We wanted to just kind of postpone that and to send those out to the people who are interested and also avoid any of those spring breaks issues. So we will be sending out a survey here in the next couple of days, and part of that survey you'll have an option to click if you want to receive red wigglers. We really look forward to that. So as we're going to take a little intermission to go ahead and grab your supplies, we are going to build our own vermicast composting kit. So you are going to need to grab your cooler. We sent you two, one to practice with us tonight and one to practice with your students. Some of our early registrants got a third cooler. So you are able to now grow those worms and separate those and get two going. So if you want to go grab your cooler, you're going to need some kind of sharp pointy thing, pencil, skewer, or better yet, for my students, I always like using power tools. So you want to grab that cordless drill. I have my own, so we'll give you a couple minutes to stretch your legs, grab those items, and then we'll start to build our vermicomposter. And if you got a drill, if you could hold your drill up, I want to know what kind of power tool you got. Oh, I think I see a Makita. Any DeWalt folks out there? Oh, a Craftsman, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. There's a DeWalt. Patrick's got his DeWalt. I've got the good old Black & Decker. This thing's probably 50 million years old, still going. So it looks like most everybody is back with us that are on the camera, have their cameras on. If everybody who's able can turn their cameras on, we are going to want to do this together. So before we go into building our kit, I want to take a quick look. Our objective was really to understand soil health and the importance of healthy soil. So if you can see here on my cooler, this is the final product of the compost, and it does have worm castings in it. One of the things we like to do is do a hot compost and then introduce our red wigglers to that hot compost, and you can see it's beautiful soil. As you start to investigate the soil with your students that we sent you, one of the things that I would suggest doing is to compress that soil. Bill really discussed that, that the worms aerate and create this beautiful soil. But if you were to compress the 3 different types of soils, you'll see that that compost is really going to compress. And when we're talking about soil health and water retention, this is a huge issue that we see when we start to lose our topsoils. And this vermicompost and compost can really start to replenish that. It gets that, puts that organic material back into the soils and really brings it to life. We've also talked about the different types of organisms that are living in healthy soil. So the first thing you want to do when you have your cooler with your students is you want to mark out the air hole patterns. So you can have your students do any kind of shape, but you want to put quite a few air holes in it. And so we're going to do that together. So you can grab your lid. One thing you have to definitely be careful with, these are 1 inch thick, and you'll notice at the bottom that we do have this ridge. If I have my students drilling or pressing down on this, it will crack. So you want to be careful as we're pressing down. You'll have some students want to go to town on it. So you definitely want to be careful with that. So once we have marked them out, we can see I put quite a few air holes, and we're going to do this together. We had mentioned some bugs. Something that you can do is take a piece of screen or cheesecloth, and you can put it underneath the lid to help keep some of those flies and other things out. So if everybody wants to grab their drills and their coolers, one of their coolers, and let's put some air holes in our cooler, and we will do that together. So Bill, I think we still have you as we're creating our coolers. Is there any type of, how many air holes do you think would be adequate? Do we really have to go to town on that?
You can, it never hurts to have as much air as you can, but you know, there's a couple of ways to do it. Like you said, with drilling holes in a box along the size of what we were talking about, I would think if you had 10 or 12 holes would probably be good. The other option is to cut out a section and then put a screen there, and then you only need maybe 2 of those because they'd be much larger for much more airflow. If you were going to do that, though, I'd suggest that on the side rather than the top, because with the moisture level, you know, as the moisture starts to evaporate, it'll condense on the lid and then drop back down and keep your moisture level consistent. If you were going to put a big hole with a screen, a lot of that condensation would, the moisture would just evaporate out.
And then one other question: do we need to worry about any holes at the bottom for any liquid retention?
A lot of new worm bins do benefit from having holes in the bottom and maybe a little tray to collect any liquid that comes out. Technically, if you running your worm bin just right, you won't have any water pooling at the bottom, so you don't need that. But a lot of new worm bins do suffer from too much moisture, so better to get that out if you can. That way it's not becoming anaerobic and start to smell.
Awesome, thank you so much.
So the other thing you could do, sorry, is just if it gets a little bit too wet and you don't have holes in the bottom, just put in more dry bedding and stir it around.
And as you finish drilling your top, if you could give me a thumbs up to know that you have completed that, we will move on to the next step in building out our container. It looks like we have a couple people left who are still drilling. So the next step Bill had discussed is that we want to start to develop a bedding. So we have the local newspaper here in the Adirondacks, the Adirondack Express. So if you want to take your paper, was one of the things that we had sent on the list. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you shred your newspaper, you want it to be about 1 inch in length. And we will add that as our base for our worms. Now we use a worm bin in our classroom, and other things that you can use. They sell. You can find them online. Is coconut husks as a bedding, which will work if you want to take. If you have any kind of twiggy material. Bill mentioned grass that has been aged. We don't want that hot grass, so we want the grass that has gone from green to brown. So once we have added our bedding, the next step is to start to add water. So I have a cup of water. We gave you a spray bottle so you can spray your bedding down. If you do not have a spray bottle, you can just dip the water. Now, one of the
Hey,
things,
excuse me, Jeremiah, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but before we move forward, we have a couple bedding questions for you and Bill. One is, it's a really good question. Can you use wood chips or shavings for a base?
I can answer that. Shavings, yeah, you want to stay away from pine to some extent because of the resin in that. But otherwise, yes, you can. If it's sawdust, it's going to compact too much and you'll lose your airspace. But shavings, yeah, they would work okay. It's very difficult to get wet though. So that's the wood chips and shavings. If you can make sure they're really wet, like probably soak them in a tub of water for overnight. But otherwise, they're just very difficult to keep the moisture level.
And Megan wants to know, would a base of rabbit manure with hay mixed in work for bedding?
That should work. Yep, rabbit manure should be okay.
And Kimberly wants to know, is it important to ensure the ink used for the newspaper is soy-based?
Well, yes. I mean, but I can tell you that any newspaper that you get in New York is using soy-based ink, so you're okay with that. I mean, if you have something that you're not certain of, it might be worth checking.
And Jeremiah, Sue wants to know, is the amount that you have in there, is that just for example, or how much should they be putting in for their bedding?
Yep, so we want to put in, we want to fill our container about 3/4 of the way full. This is going to compress once we start to add water. Bill did mention the amount of water can be an issue. So you can see here, if I can wring it out, I don't want it much wetter than that. You want it damp, but you don't want it soaking wet. Worms don't like a ton of water. That's an issue if you've ever been out on a downpour and you notice the worms crawling all over the place. They don't like to sit in pools of water. So we don't want to get it soaking wet, but we want to make it damp. So the next step is, I like to personally add my soil. So at this point, what we would do is we would want to start to add the soil that we sent you, the Adirondack soil. Really, we want to see your students be able to enrich the soil. The soil that we sent you was poor on a purpose. It does have some more organic matter. It does have some sand. But the things that we're going to add to this is really going to benefit the soil. And that's the investigation that we would like for your students to carry out in your classroom. So if you could take a picture of the beginning product, you don't want to necessarily dump this whole bag in here to begin with. You want to add a couple cupfuls, enough for them to acclimate and have something to really climb into. You can see that there's quite a bit of organic roots and stuff in there. So they're going to like that. And you can definitely get the smell of the Adirondacks when you smell this soil. And so then your last step is that you want to start to add, and I wouldn't do it today unless you want to start to operate your worm farm at the house. We'd start to add our different types of greens to it. So our food, so like our lettuce, our tomatoes, our eggshells. Worms have a gizzard, much like a turkey, so they like things like coffee grinds. It helps them to start to crush and macerate some of the things that they are eating through. So then our last step is to add our soil. We want the soil again to be wet, so we would spray that down also. And then what I like to do once I've started to add my material is I like to add just a layer of newspaper on top. Bill mentioned that worms like to hide out. They don't like a lot of light. So that's going to start to help them, number one, to hide underneath that layer. But number two, is going to start that next area for my worms to move up. So as my worms start to eat and leave their castings behind, as I add to this and continue to build this bin, they're going to want to move up, leaving their castings below and eat the things that I add. As Bill mentioned, something that you can do is that you can always reach in and you can mix that around and bury some of those things. So then my last step would be to add my screen on the bottom and add my top, and I should be good to go. This is it. So I have a question from Sue. That's the same question. Is how much bedding do we put in?
That's the same question from before. Yep.
Are there any other questions on constructing the bin? So something that we found in our classroom, and we'll transition from here, is that anytime we can get our students engaged with things like soil, and to start to identify that concept on how important soil is to agriculture and our environment, that's another way for us to possibly fundraise and to create products that they're able to use to help to go back in building opportunities. So as you're building your agricultural focused areas, this is a great opportunity to create a product and a great product at a very low price, and be able to have your students use that product to raise funds for your different agricultural spaces. Really, to understand the importance of soil health is really important. So as we're wrapping up here, I would like for us to reflect, and then Katie's gonna do some final bookkeeping. But I want to reflect on our objective. So our objective was to understand soil health and how we can increase that soil health within our agricultural spaces. So if we can go back to our reflection piece and identify from your experience today, many of you posted what you thought you were meeting our objective. Could you put back in your chat after our lessons, reflecting on the lessons, how well do you know the importance of soil health? And it looks like many people have made huge growth through this professional development. This is, again, a reflective piece that we can use throughout any of the lessons, be it pre-made curriculum. We just put a box in the top left, reflect on your knowledge on this objective beforehand, and at the end, as you're in your observations, it's a great way to have your students just hold up a couple of fingers, but it's also a great way for you to really reflect on your teaching and the students' learning. So if I see a group of students that are still at 2, I can go back and grab that too. So Katie, thank you so much, Bill.
And Bill, if you don't mind, we had another question come in before we get to our wrap up and all the details you need to know about your CTLE and getting your worms in the mail. So Danielle wants to know how much greens can go in these containers that we just built. What should that ratio look like?
It's a good question because overfeeding can cause problems in the bin. And you want to let the worms guide you on that. So one of the best ways to do that is what's called pocket feeding. If you put just a small amount of food in one corner, let's say, check on that, again, bury it under some bedding, check on that every couple of days. You want the worms to work through that within about a week or so, and then move to another corner, put new food there, let them work on that for about a week. If it's not consumed, then you don't want to add more. If they're consuming it and there's virtually nothing left, add more at that point, and you'll start to get an idea. And so you can feed them every couple of days or once a week, depending on how you want to. They eat the bedding as well, so they'll consume the paper that's in there. So they're not going to starve, but you definitely don't want to overfeed them. So wait till they finish what's in there before you give them more.
And Sue wants to know,
Thank you.
should we put any greens in here without the worms?
I would suggest doing that probably a day or so beforehand, 1 or 2 days beforehand, so that it starts to break down, the microbes start to process that. Worms don't have any teeth, so they can't bite a chunk off of a wilting piece of lettuce, but they can sort of suck up the thing as it's really decomposing, and they're also eating the microbes. So the more that the bin is in a process of decomposing materials when the worms go in, the better.
Excellent. Any final questions for Bill? So Jeremiah is just going to show you again that scale that he's working with his students on about how they feel about their knowledge gained, that they be from the beginning to the end of the lesson. As you think about your reflection. So with that, we want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us. We are having a lot of fun with these virtual PD sessions. We're having a great fun with guests like Bill coming in and going to go visit the authority to go see their incredible compost program. And we're excited to make things with all of you. We hope in the near future we can all get together in person and get to know one another and spend a whole day together doing these really awesome things on a farm site or an ag site, and just get to know our programs a little bit more and think about where they could go and what they could do. So we want to again remind you of that great tool so that you can find the right tools for your grade level on that curriculum matrix that I showed you. That's free tool available to you. We'll be linking the lessons from today from that tool so that you have them at your disposal and so that you can do these lessons with your students. We also want to share that you are able to receive your 2 hours of CTLE, and that's going to be included in your evaluation link that you're going to receive. So we do ask you fill out that evaluation. The second page of that is going to be information we need to process your CTLE. Once we get a bulk of our responses back, we'll do a mailing out so that you can get your certificate and then upload that to your Teach profile. We want to just share, I mentioned in the chat, April 1, we are launching our Grow With Us grant. And so that's where you can earn a tower garden, a bundle of 3 tower gardens with lights and dollies, all the bells and whistles. So that's going to be available. We'll give out dozens of those. So be watching on our newsletter and our mailing list. And even if I just also want to mention, even if you are not going to get the CTLE, we would love to hear your feedback about the session and how it went for you. So please do fill out that evaluation. I also just want to give some reminders of other upcoming experiences. We're going to be launching some additional virtual field trips for your students to take part in. We have at least two more virtual professional development experiences coming out. So be watching your email for those. And one in April and one in May. And then we are going to be launching a scholarship to our National Agriculture in the Classroom Conference through their virtual option. So that'll be after school lets out last week in June. And that'll be just an exciting experience all in itself. And we want to pay for you to do that experience. So with that, what final questions do you have? Excellent. Well, we can't wait to spend more time with you and tell your colleagues about this. You're going to receive the recording of this session so that you can go back and watch it again or refresh your memory. You do have to tell us in your evaluation if you want the worms. So that's how you're going to get your half pound of worms mailed to you in April. You have to check, yes, I want them. So if you went through this and you were like, I don't think worms are for me, that's okay. You don't have to request them, but if you do want them, we're excited to send them to you. All right, well, everyone have a great day. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the sunshine.